Hi, Daisy friends. It is such a beautiful day. I decided to take my reading outside today, and I hope that you'll do the same. Get outside and get as much fresh air as you can. I have a beautiful forsythia bush right behind me, and I thought you might love that gorgeous yellow. So our next chapter in Charlotte's Web is chapter 14, and it's called Dr. Dorian. Let's find out who Dr. Dorian is. The next day was Saturday. Fern stood at the kitchen sink drying the breakfast dishes as her mother washed them. Mrs. Arable worked silently. She hoped that Fern would go out and play with other children instead of heading for the Zuckerman's barn to sit and watch animals. Charlotte is the best storyteller I ever heard, said Fern, poking her dish towel into a cereal bowl. Fern, said her mother sternly, you must not invent things. You know spiders don't tell stories. Spiders can't talk. Charlotte can, replied Fern. She doesn't talk very loud, but she talks. What kind of story did she tell? Asked Mrs. Arable. Well, began Fern, she told us about a cousin of hers who caught a fish in her web. Don't you think that's fascinating? Fern, dear, how would a fish get into a spider's web, said Mrs. Arable. You know it couldn't happen. You're making this up. Oh, no, it happened all right, said Fern. Charlotte never fibs. This cousin of hers built a web across a stream. One day she was hanging around on the web and a tiny little fish leaped into the air and got tangled in the web. The fish was caught by one fin, Mother. Its tail was wildly thrashing and dangerously going back and forth under the weight of the fish. And Charlotte's cousin kept slipping in, dodging out, and she was beaten mercilessly over the head by the wildly thrashing fish, dancing in, dancing out, throwing. Fern, snapped her mother, stop it! Stop inventing these wild tales. I'm not inventing, said Fern. I'm just telling you the facts. What finally happened? Asked her mother, whose curiosity began to get the better of her. Charlotte's cousin won. She wrapped the fish up, then she ate him when she was good and ready. Spiders have to eat, the same as the rest of us. Yes, I suppose they do, said Mrs. Arable vaguely. Charlotte has another cousin, continued Fern, who is a balloonist. She stands on her head, lets out a line, and is carried aloft on the wind. Mother, wouldn't you simply love to do that? Yes, I would, come to think of it, replied Mrs. Arable. But Fern, darling, I wish you would play outdoors today instead of going to Uncle Homer's barn. Find some of your playmates and do something nice outdoors with other kids. You're spending too much time in that barn. It isn't good for you to be alone so much. Alone, said Fern. Alone? My best friends are in the barn cellar. It's a very sociable place, not at all lonely. Fern disappeared after a while, walking down the road toward Zuckerman's. Her mother dusted the sitting room. As she worked, she kept thinking about Fern. It didn't seem natural for a little girl to be so interested in animals. Finally, Mrs. Arable made up her mind she would pay a call on old Dr. Dorian and ask his advice. She got in the car and drove to his office in the village. Dr. Dorian had a thick beard. He was glad to see Mrs. Arable and gave her a comfortable chair. It's about Fern, she explained. Fern spends entirely too much time in the Zuckerman's barn. It does not seem normal. She sits on a milk stool in the corner of the barn cellar near the pig pen and watches animals hour after hour. She just sits and listens. Dr. Dorian leaned back and closed his eyes. How enchanting, he said. It must be real nice and quiet down there. Homer has some sheep, hasn't he? Yes, said Mrs. Arable, but it all started with that pig we let Fern raise on a bottle. She calls him Wilbur. Homer bought the pig, and ever since it left our place, Fern has been going to her uncle's barn to be near it. I've been hearing things about that pig, said Dr. Dorian, opened his eyes. They say he's quite a pig. Have you heard about the words that appeared in the spider's web? Mrs. Arable said nervously. Yes, replied the doctor. Well, do you understand it? Said Mrs. Arable. Understand what? Do you understand how there could be anything written in a spider's web? Oh, no, said Dr. Dorian. I don't understand it. But for that matter, I don't understand how a spider learned to spin a web in the first place. When the words appeared, everyone said they were a miracle. Nobody pointed out that the web itself is a miracle. What's miraculous about a spider's web? Asked Mrs. Arable. I don't see why you say a web is a miracle. It's just a web. Ever try to spin one? Said Dr. Dorian. So let's take a look at the picture. Here is Fern's mother, and she went to see Dr. Dorian. And what are you thinking? Is Dr. Dorian as concerned about Fern as her mother is? Let's see. Mrs. Arable shifted uneasily in her chair. No, she replied, but I can crochet a doily and I can knit a sock. Sure, said the doctor, but somebody taught you, didn't they? My mother taught me. Well, who taught a spider? A young spider knows how to spin a web without any instructions from anyone. Don't you regard that as a miracle? I suppose I do, said Mrs. Arable. I never looked at it that way before. Still, I don't understand how those words got into the web. I just don't understand it, and I don't like what I can't understand. None of us do, said Dr. Dorian, sighing. I'm a doctor. Doctors are supposed to understand everything, but I don't understand everything, and I don't intend to let it worry me. Mrs. Arable fidgeted. Fern says the animals talk to each other. Dr. Dorian, do you believe that animals can talk? I never heard one say anything, he replied, but that proves nothing. It is quite possible that an animal has spoken civilly to me and that I didn't catch the remark because I wasn't paying attention. Children pay attention better than grown-ups. What do you think about that? Children pay attention even better than grown-ups. If Fern says that the animals in Zuckerman's barn talk, I'm quite ready to believe her. Perhaps if people talked less, animals would talk more. People are incessant talkers. I can give you my word on that. Well, I feel better about Fern, said Mrs. Arable. You don't think I need to worry about her? Does she look well, said the doctor. Oh, yes. Appetite good? Oh, yes, she's always hungry. Sleep well at night? Oh, yes. And don't worry, said the doctor. Don't worry. Do you think she'll ever stop thinking about something besides pigs and sheep and geese and spiders? How old is Fern? Mrs. Arable said, she's 8. Well, said Dr. Dorian, I think she will always love animals, but I doubt that she'll spend her entire life in Homer Zuckerman's barn cellar. How about boys? Does she know any boys? She knows Henry Fussy, said Mrs. Arable brightly. Dr. Dorian closed his eyes again and went into deep thought. Henry Fussy, he mumbled. Remarkable. Well, I don't think you have anything to worry about. Let Fern associate with her friends in the barn if she wants to. I would say offhand that spiders and pigs were fully as interesting as Henry Fussy. Yet I predict that the day will come when even Henry will drop some chance remark that catches Fern's attention. It's amazing how children change from year to year. How's Avery? He asked, opening his eyes wide. Remember Avery, Fern's big brother? Oh, Avery, chuckled Mrs. Arable. Avery is always fine. Of course, he gets into poison ivy and gets stung by wasps and bees and brings frogs and snakes home and breaks everything he lays his hands on. He's fine. Good, said the doctor. Mrs. Arable said goodbye and thanked Dr. Dorian very much for his advice. She felt greatly relieved. So I'm wondering what you think. Do you think Fern's okay? Do you think that the animals talk with her? Do you think if we talked less and listened more, we might also be able to hear those animals? Let me know what you think. Talk to some grown-ups near you and see if they can help you leave a comment after this post. Let me know what you think. Have animals talked to you? Do you understand animals? When we come back next time, we will read The Crickets, and The Crickets is chapter 15 for next time. Until then, take care, be well, and it's Mrs. Rose signing off from the Forsythia Patch. Mwah! Take care.